the connection between content and film. It's one of my favorite subjects because I have three distinct careers: a novelist, a journalist, and a screenwriter. And one of my favorite subjects is a relationship between nonfiction and film, and turning stories, real stories, truth, into film. Films that say they're true or films that say they're based on the truth. It's one of my most favorite subjects because it's the most subversive. It's a dangerous thing to talk about, and it gets me in trouble and gets other people in trouble all the time. As an art form, movies can overwhelm nonfiction, be more powerful, more dangerous, more lasting. They can even be truer than nonfiction, truer than journalism, because they're allowed to lie. Movies are encouraged to lie, they're required to lie, and that's frankly because lies are simply more powerful than the truth. Journalism, nonfiction, stories that become movies, they're about what happens. Movies are entertainment. They're made to entertain. And it's the rare true story, the informationally accurate story, that's entertaining by itself. For instance, Oskar Schindler, Schindler's List. I don't think Schindler was as good as the movie made him out to be. All the President's Men, one of my favorite movies as a journalist. You know, Redford and Bernstein were much more heroic, probably, than Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. In truth, Woodward and Bernstein only knew what they knew when Mark Felt, who was Deep Throat, if you remember, wanted them to know it. But the movie apotheosized them, turned them into heroes. I've had three distinct careers, as I said. As a novelist, I was trapped in a room for years, isolated, writing 2 novels and a third in progress. As a journalist, mostly as a war correspondent, investigative reporter for the New York Times Magazine, it was like dangling midair, obviously metaphorically, and for the most part poorly paid. The physical peril of war correspondence, and the isolation, the self-loathing of being a novelist when you sit there wringing your hands most of the time. But screenwriting, writing for film and TV is hard for a whole other set of reasons. The screenplay is merely the egg and the sperm of the movie. Once you've written the draft that seems to be a makeable piece of visual storytelling, the embryo grows into an operational body. Hundreds, dozens, and hundreds of people come on. You lose control. And screenplays, the best of them, they're merely sheet music. Rhythm, melody. Being a screenwriter is like being a songwriter without a voice. You don't actually ever get to sing the song. But I was thinking about this relationship between real-life stories and movies. And I have to add the disclaimer, because any narrative about life, any story, either real or imagined, is a story first and malleable. And I was thinking about this, as a journalist, our job is to tell the truth. You write movies, you write novelists, obviously not so much. But I was thinking about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And I have this argument with journalists all the time is, what are the limits of nonfiction writing? What are the limits of movies? Whenever a human being sets eyes upon something, he changes what he's looking at. It's never possible to actually capture an event, a war, a piece of information, a story in its organic form. Things happen without architecture. They happen without narrative and chronology. And a reporter, even a newspaper reporter, who's there merely to report information, set it down, changes what he looks at by his very presence. A photographer friend of mine, a war photographer friend of mine, every time he shows up with a camera, whoever he's taking a picture of will perform for him, sometimes kill for him, sometimes save a life for him. So who knows what really happened? You can't know what really happened because what happens changes by merely looking at it by your very presence. So when a newspaper reporter cuts out inches of an article for space, it's like taking pieces out of a puzzle and you're changing the whole. And all that's done for political reasons or practical reasons or logistical reasons. And every reporter brings, of course, his or her story to what he's looking at. It's not humanly possible for one person to tell the whole truth about any one particular thing. For instance, on a benign level, I'm adapting the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot for HBO. And I don't know if you're familiar with that book. In the United States, it was a massive sensation. It's a fascinating story, important story. And the book itself is actually a fantastic movie, but what was left out after I spent a long time with the author is her story. That is, she's present in the book and obviously a character in the movie, But in the book, she's restrained, she's humble almost to a fault, and there's none of her in there. And when I sat with her, I realized, well, this woman is actually part of the story. She's integral. She herself is a character, but she left herself out. So it was a choice. So she changed the story, and she uncovered a story that was otherwise uncovered. And I was also having this conversation with a friend of mine who's a psychologist, and it interested me, and I said, how do you know when your clients are telling you the truth? How do you know when you're hearing the truth? How do you know when you know that your clients are telling the truth? And he said he doesn't. But what he did say is that the truth smokes itself out, the truth arises. And it's important to me because of this relationship between nonfiction and fiction. What I'm trying to say is the best way to tell the truth just might actually be to lie. That is, a movie or television can capture the spirit of a thing without ever trying to be accurate. In other words, intention, what a person intended to say, intended to be. So I was thinking of three kinds of relationships between storytelling, nonfiction storytelling, and movies. I want to talk about from my own experience. And just to add the disclaimer, I'm not here to proclaim or to declare anything about the movie business or TV business in general. I'm going to talk from my own experience, talk for another 10, 15 minutes, and afterwards happy to take your questions, because it's a thorny issue. A movie like Schindler's List, for instance, was magnificent and heroic and beautiful, but the truth of it, obviously much more complicated. All the President's Men, other examples like that. So the first relationship I call the circle. That is, movies create inspiration for life, and life creates inspiration for nonfiction stories, and you end up with a movie. The way I became a journalist is actually I was a novelist, purely a novelist. I was writing my third novel sort of in a pristine prison in upstate New York in the United States at a writer's colony. I was trapped. At this writer's colony, every famous writer who ever lived had spent time there, so it was very traditional. There were signs, Philip Roth jerked off here, Truman Capote went to the bathroom here. It was all very traditional and very, very sort of self-important. And I felt hemmed in and bored and very indulgent. So I escaped, and I went to see Michael Mann's movie, The Insider. And The Insider was about a man, a journalist, which I was about to become, who ran into the wall that every good investigative journalist runs into eventually. And that is, there are stories that are simply too true to tell. There are stories that are too dangerous that no one actually wants to hear. In the case of The Insider, Michael's movie, it was corporate forces marshaling against the simple revelation that smoking causes cancer. I don't know if you remember that movie. But I saw The Insider, and I saw the sacrifice of what a journalist can do to tell the truth, to tell the story that's too true to tell. And as I was saying, I was spending my days in this kind of pristine, museum prison, indulgent. I felt irrelevant. I left a note, and I left. And I escaped. And 2 weeks later, I found myself on a refugee flight to Macedonia, and then spent the next 2 months in Kosovo following the war. I had no training at all as a journalist. All I knew, and when my parents and my friends asked me what the hell I was doing, as a novelist who really had no experience in the world, I said I really just meant to go see what we do to each other and why. That's all. My first day in Kosovo, fields of body parts. My first day, I found a well full of dead children and babies, and I got the answer to my question. But it was all information. And I started collecting dictionary entries of experience, but not tellable stories. These were obviously not movies. And at the time, I had no path and no interest in writing movies or television. I actually had no path whatsoever. Ironically, a couple years later, when I was writing for the New York Times Magazine, I wrote a story about sex trafficking, sex slavery into the United States that encountered the same kind of confrontation and controversy that existed in Michael Mann's movie, The Insider, about smoking. I was confronted with the political expectation that I was denounced. From the left and the right, I was told that I made it up. I was told that I was a sociopath. I'd spent 6 months risking my life infiltrating sex trafficking networks in Eastern Europe and Mexico and the United States. And professional jealousy and political agendas, and eventually the story was turned into a movie called Trade, which helped to vindicate the truth. And it was this sort of massive hall of mirrors. That is, the truth by itself on the page, the New York Times Magazine, ostensibly the #1 magazine in the world, the most authoritative, wasn't good enough. But once it was turned into a movie, it was sort of accepted as whole truth. Which leads me to the second relationship between life and movies. After 9/11, I was in Pakistan and Afghanistan, again for the Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and I was beginning to get interested in writing for film and television, partly because of trade. And I remember I was in Pakistan, I flew back from Islamabad to Los Angeles, which is 24 hours in the air each way, for a meeting with Michael Mann, of all people, just to talk to him about a movie. And the story I was working on for the Times was about the arms trafficker Victor Bout, who's a Russian the most prolific arms trafficker in the world. And at the time, no one had ever met him because he was so reclusive. I spent 6 months tracking him down, and I spent 2 weeks with him in Moscow, and I had written a story for the Times about him. At the moment, he's in New York on trial for his crimes. But Victor was one of the most fascinating individuals I'd ever met. And he was brilliant and funny and acerbic and deeply, deeply truthful about the way the world operated. You know, he's a monster. He commits crimes for a living. He feeds the wars. In fact, his planes would land in Liberia with weapons for both sides of the conflict, both sides of the Civil War. The plane would turn around, go back to Brussels, pick up UN peacekeepers, and go back to Liberia to stop the conflict that he himself was arming. I mean, there's a kind of cynicism to him that was actually kind of beautiful and perfect and symmetrical. So he was a fascinating subject for a movie. So I flew back to Los Angeles to sit with Michael to write this script and talk about writing the script. And Michael and I were so obsessed with Victor and the subject. We're so obsessed by the truth and the information, the facts, and the world, and Victor's world, and his world of gangsters and women and warlords, all very evocative. And you talk about Victor Bout, you talk about arms trafficking, you just think movies. In fact, The Lord of War, which starred Nicolas Cage, was loosely based on Victor. And it overwhelmed both of us. I mean, at that point, I was a novice screenwriter. Michael Mann was who he was. He was magnificent and brilliant. And it overwhelmed our good ideas about character. The information completely took us over. It's one of the great characters of modern times, and we couldn't do a damn thing with it. And so here's Victor Bout, the notorious arms trafficker, and I was overwhelmed. And neither Michael and I could figure it out. We spent years on the project. And my point is that this is an example in which information and the truth can completely diminish and demolish any idea of creating another kind of art form, film about it. But the third relationship between the truth and fiction I think of as symbiosis, which is when it really works perfectly. If you remember, about 3 years ago, there was a magnificently dramatic hostage rescue in Colombia in which Ingrid Betancourt, the French-Colombian presidential candidate, 3 Americans and I think 12 or 13 others were rescued from the jungle after between 6 and 15 years tied to trees by their neck by the FARC in Colombia, probably the most brutal terrorist organization in the world. When the hostage rescue happened, I have a lot of relationships, obviously, in the journalism world, and I tapped into them in Washington. And the story was that Colombian operatives landed, pretended to be Red Cross or something like the Red Cross, and fooled the FARC and pulled them out of the jungle and flew away. But you have a sense that that was obviously not even scratching the surface of what happened. So I called and I visited Washington, and I got a sense that the story was much greater. And I went to producer friends of mine, and we went to Warner Brothers, and we sold the movie, just on the concept that something bigger than that had actually happened. We had no idea what the movie was, only that it was a movie, because it was a great, big, dramatic rescue. So I went down to Colombia for the next year, 5 or 6 times, and I discovered, and the script is called The Mission, it's being made in the spring. David O. Russell, who directed The Fighter, is going to be directing it, and it looks like Brad Pitt is going to take the lead. But that last piece of information is crucial, because this is ostensibly on the surface a Colombian mission, so why is an American the star of this movie, aside from the fact that it's an American movie? So I went down there, and I was being funded not by the New York Times, by Warner Brothers. The New York Times couldn't afford to fund me in the way I needed to be funded to find out the truth of this story. A movie company, a movie studio obviously could. And like a lot of great history that we don't know about, it all started off with a blowjob. The whole case, the whole way to crack the hostage crisis started off with an act of sex. And what I found was the operatives were not just Colombian, but there were Americans involved and Israelis. And the truth of it was really kind of a perfect symbiosis of various people of different nationalities. The story in the movie is going to be much truer than the story you've read in the newspapers. The story in the movie is actually much fuller. The story in the movie is going to be a lot truer. And so it's a perfect symbiosis in which the idea, the nascent idea, scratched, and then you go and you write the movie and you come out actually with a much deeper truth. And again, you know, the visual art form, I think, can be much truer to the spirit, but in this case, they're much more factually accurate. So I wanted to actually just stop there and see if you had any questions about this relationship between nonfiction and film. Let me talk for a minute about, these are the end of my prepared remarks, but let me talk for a minute about All the President's Men, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. I actually find that the most interesting example of what I'm talking about. It's very famous. It made Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman stars. Obviously, Richard Nixon in Watergate was, you know, one of the most instrumental aspects of American and international politics. A few years ago, when Deep Throat, Mark Felt died. Mark Felt was the #2 man in the FBI. If you remember, he'd confessed to being Deep Throat. Tom Hanks and Universal Studios bought his life rights, and I was hired to write the screenplay. And again, because of my journalistic background, it seemed valuable at the time. But All the President's Men is an iconic film, right? I mean, Woodward and Bernstein, Redford and Hoffman, these are indestructible, iconic. They're kind of like the Mount Rushmore of journalism, investigative journalism, and of politics. So in some sense, I was attacking or beginning to investigate sort of the unattackable. And what I found actually was really fascinating, because Woodward and Bernstein, in writing All the President's Men, had sort of created themselves in this sort of godlike structure of having cracked the entire thing. And what I found out was actually a very profoundly moving, emotional story. Mark Felt, Deep Throat, a love story between him and his wife, bringing down Richard Nixon, partly out of politics, but mostly out of love for his wife, who was mad and a Democrat and hated Richard Nixon. Again, this is why history really happens, not from political agenda, but because of human emotion. And Woodward and Bernstein, completely manipulated by Felt, knowing what they knew only when Felt wanted them to know it. And the screenplay's done, and hopefully, you know, Tom will be doing it shortly. But again, this relationship, you know, the earlier one, the earlier movie, All the President's Men, creating an entire heroic canvas that doesn't exist. It's actually not even the truth. And yet, this is now what we believe to be the truth. Anyway, yes? The title of the film, it's right now the working title is just Deep Throat. We don't actually have a greater title than that. Sorry? Jay Roach. The director is Jay Roach. Anything else? Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, yes, oh, I'm sorry, right here. This is something about a visual storytelling is what? Right. The difference between visual storytelling and storytelling on the page. You know, film and TV, the only art form that actually hits all of your senses. On a very biological level, obviously the visual, but because of soundtrack music, it also hits you in an auditory way that moves your cells. I mean, not speaking technically in a way. But the reason film and TV is such a perfect experience, the perfectly embracing and all-engrossing experience, it takes your whole body, it takes your mind, it engages your imagination and your intellect, and it's really the perfect art form. It's the perfect whole art form. But it's still a piece of entertainment. You know, when you read a novel, when you read an article, it engages your intellect, and it engages your imagination in an evocative way, that it inspires you to sort of fill in the blanks. Film and TV puts it all in front of you. It's actually it's a passive mechanism. You're sitting there, and you're being sort of invaded with the story, and you're sitting there and purely absorbing it. And it sort of takes over your body in that way. But it only works as an act of manipulation. You know, film and TV is about triggering emotion. It's not really about triggering the intellect. and it's about triggering. It can inspire. That's the best of film and television, inspires you to go out and feel something. You know, for instance, I don't know if Moneyball has opened here yet, the Brad Pitt movie. It's a magnificent film. It's about baseball, the American sport baseball, but it's not about baseball at all. It's actually about a subversive, contrarian man who takes over a baseball team and does something that goes completely contrary to every aspect of modern baseball. Who cares about baseball? I saw it with my Russian-Israeli girlfriend and my Romanian manager. They knew nothing about baseball, but they were inspired because it was really about contrarianism and subversiveness. And that film and TV does that, I think, much better than novels and nonfiction. Yes?
I'm just trying to maybe connect the circle a little more. I mean, you pick your stories from reality, and then you've had this beautiful sort of talk now about what truth and not truth and how you can, all that which was beautiful. I'm just wondering, once you've done the film, have you sort of connected the dot back to reality again? Like, I mean, for example, with the trafficking project, like CNN have this huge freedom project now, which is on social media, it's events, it's engaging people, it's trying to change laws, I mean, it's a very ambitious project. I don't know if CNN will succeed with it, but did Trade, for example, it was an article, so it was cross-media, it became a film. Was it something else? I mean,
it can. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it, is it can rebound. You know, you can create, for instance, if nonfiction is the origin, the genesis, then you create a film that's sort of true-ish, truthy, journalists like to say. But it inspires social action or awareness. That is sort of the perfect, beautiful circle. But any film that intends to do that, I think, usually fails because it has a sense of sort of self-importance and indulgence about it. It becomes neither entertaining nor informational. It becomes sort of an act of hand-wringing worry. There are films, I think, that straddle the line beautifully. I thought the Rwanda film, Hotel Rwanda, was a great example. Yeah, I thought that was a beautiful example. But again, in the end, films are about character and emotion. They're not about information. They're not about what happens.
That's more documentary, probably.
Yeah, like more documentary, correct.
So I mean, we're at a cross-platform event, so how to engage cross-platform in what you're doing in a way is saying that the film in itself can inspire, it can inform, entertain, and the cross-platform is mainly just to spread that further out so maybe more people will know about the film. But you can't really probably engage because then you have that balance you just said now between wanting to...
It can't be the filmmaker's intention to create an important after effect. It won't work. It'll be too unemotional. But the beautiful thing about the internet, for instance, there was a television show I was conceiving, sort of a news show about sort of a news organization, and you could have the sort of the scripted version on air on the television, but on the web you could then follow characters and real journalists, from that television, starting off at that platform, moving them back to their lives and their assignments. So you could cross-platform in that way, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
The two examples that you've made, one of them was where the film told the real story, and the other one was where we thought we knew, or where All the President's Men, for instance, was not telling the real story, but it sort of got at the meaning behind it. When you're either writing something or producing it or discussing how you're going to make the film, when is that decision actually made, whether you're going to fictionalize it or whether you're going to tell the truth?
It's a really good question, and it's different for every project. Sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes the truth is good enough. In the film about Deep Throat, about Mark Felt, the truth of his story is so unassailable and graceful that we actually left it alone. I mean, hopefully in 2-3 years you'll see it. In the case of the Columbia movie, The Mission, when you're writing, sometimes it's a simple logistical problem of too many faces. For instance, the American star of that film is a conflation of 2 or 3 Americans who were involved in the mission. We just don't want to hire 3 actors and have 3 different lives to track and keep track of. Sometimes it's purely practical in that sense. Sometimes it's about a movie star. Sometimes it's about, if you get the right movie star, you want to give that movie star all the lines, all the good intentions, all the good moves. all the sexy moves. So it's usually about streamlining. You have 90 minutes to 2 hours to tell a story. And look, the truth doesn't have chronology. The truth unspools organically and spontaneously. It doesn't have an architecture to it. It doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. The 3-act structure, I don't know if you know, the screenplays and movies are structured by 3 acts. Life is not 3 acts. Nothing is 3 acts. Nothing in life is 3 acts. But one of the reasons screenplays and movies are structured that way is, and it's actually not thought of very much, but I've come to believe since I'm different kinds of storyteller, novels also, by the way, are unstructured in that sense. But I feel like we as humans, and I think it goes back to oral storytelling, prehistoric, pre-print, pre-language, pre-written language, we're hardwired to hear stories in certain ways. And the 3-act structure may sound like a cynical invention from the 20s Hollywood. It's not. It mimics how people hear and absorb and tell stories. There's a beginning, an introduction. There's the stuff that happens in the meat in the middle, and then the 3rd act is how it all resolves. So all of it's an artifice. All of it's artificial. So if you start with that principle, and you're a writer working with a director, working with a producer, it's all collaborative. You have to look at the material on the page and say, is this working according to those principles? And if it's too much, if it's too diffuse, if it's too many people to keep track of, if you're bored, there's no momentum. Remember I talked about a screenplay as sheet music, as a song. Every song has a melody and a rhythm and a bridge and a beginning and then a conclusion. Movies are the exact same way. So you get rid of what doesn't work. The problem is once you begin to add characters and eliminate characters to serve the structure of a movie, what are you doing? You're creating fiction. So you may, like I wrote this movie about that hostage rescue, The Mission. By the time it's made, it may be unrecognizable, to the people who were in it. But it might inspire, but again, spiritually is exactly what happened, if you know what I mean, like the spirit of a thing versus the actual action. Look, it's very subversive, and look, as a journalist, it's a very dangerous subject matter, because what I'm saying to you is, having been in the field for years, for the New York Times and others, in conflict or even just investigative reporting, every writer brings his or her story and intention and, look, political agenda to everything they do. There's no such thing as empirical truth. It just doesn't exist. For instance, I always tell this story. When I was in Pakistan, this is the 2 or 3 weeks after 9/11, I was in Peshawar, and I was at a rally, and the speaker of the rally was an imam who a couple weeks later was actually assassinated. He was a very right-wing imam, very dangerous, very vocal. And there were 20,000 people listening to him, and they were sitting in perfect silence and respect, listening to this guy. I had no idea what he was saying, but it was a non-violent rally. It was massive, but non-violent. CNN shows up, and I'm there. There are a lot of journalists there. CNN shows up, and 10 or 15 kids, they're basically kids who had nothing better to do. The fodder for a lot of these wars, the same in Kosovo and Bosnia, a lot of these were teenagers who were just looking for an identity, looking for a thing. They stood up. They were kind of laughing. They took out a flag. They burnt the flag, and they had like a mini riot. It was literally less than the size of this room. So I went back to my hotel that night, and I was watching CNN's footage of this rally. And what they did is they moved the frame in, and all you got were those 15 kids burning and chanting, and it looked like the place was blowing up. So that's news. That's what we get every day. I'll look at an event just because I'm interested. The way the New York Times covers an event versus BBC versus CNN versus Al Jazeera, the same event, it's unrecognizable. So I've come to be, I think, healthily cynical about nonfiction. And I think especially today, given the demise of journalism, the contraction of it, and the rise of the blogosphere of opinion, hard information, what happens, is harder and harder to find. It seems all very fluid to me. So in the end, I know this is it sounds silly, but filmmaking, television may be the truest thing we can find. It might be the most reliable way to get information in a way on what matters.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, given the fact that your subjects are so widely spread and political and social and engaging, when you start writing a screenplay, how do you choose from which perspective you tell the story, or how do you know that that particular character or the perspective of that character is right in a cinematic manner?
It depends on the project. For instance, The Immortal Life of Henrietta. Anybody here familiar with this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? I don't know if it was in the United States it was a massive sensation. But Oprah Winfrey wants to get back into the acting business. So she optioned it. HBO is doing it. She's going to star in this movie. So guess whose movie this is going to be? You know, that's the character that we're going to lean on. Because we have, and you know, and not to be so cynical, you know, it takes someone of that weight to get a movie made these days, especially a movie that's, you know, not very commercial. In the case of the Deep Throat movie, is obviously about Mark Felt, about Deep Throat. The Columbia movie, I did not know. I mean, it's rare to get it for a movie studio to take, especially today, to bet on someone to say, look, I'm going to go to Columbia, and I don't know what the movie is. I'm going to go and I'm going to find out. And the only reason they did it is because I had a producer working with me who is massively successful and very well known. They trusted him that I wouldn't fuck it up. In other words, if I screwed it up, it would be on his shoulders. So they knew that, so they put their trust in him. And I did not know whose movie it was, but I came back with the story. I'm trying to think of other examples. Usually when you set up a film or a TV show, you go in, you sell it based on a particular premise and on a particular principle and on a particular point of view. Sometimes it's because you have an actor attached to play that role. Sometimes it's about a director who already has a point of view. And sometimes, you know, it could be as arbitrary as a studio head being fascinated. Yeah, I'll give you an example. I'm writing a movie for Paramount Studios about a submarine. It's sort of a new submarine movie. You know, American nuclear submarines have a board instruction. If leadership on land were decapitated from a nuclear event or a natural disaster, nuclear submarines, this is terrifying, but they have orders aboard as to what to do. And the choices are, you know, retaliate, basically bring an end to mankind, don't retaliate, or it's up to you. Meaning the submarine captain somehow below the surface of the water has to determine what's really happening on land and respond or not with, you know, Trident nuclear, you know, missiles. And, you know, so I brought this point of view to Paramount, and the head of the movie studio had a particular interest in submarines. He was interested in one piece of this and not the other piece, and that's going to be the movie. It wasn't my idea, but it was his idea, but he's paying the bill. So it can be as mercenary as that.
So you don't tell the story from the, I don't know, political perspective, the military perspective. You tell the story of that particular submarine, of the captain that's on that ship and the decisions he has to make.
You tell the story from the point of view of character, not of politics. It can't be. It has to be that way because, as I was saying before, you know, film and TV has to be an emotional experience first. It can't be a political experience. The politics is secondary, maybe even tertiary. I was thinking actually of Paul Greengrass's movie Bloody Sunday, which I loved. And you know, Paul is a former journalist, and so he was particularly sort of ferocious about getting his facts right. But if you remember that film, it was really from the point of view of that man, of that priest who is, you know, running the protest and then trying to save these people. If you don't attach to a particular point of view, it's unwatchable because you can't ingest it. It's too much. It's like music it's like chaos. It's like chaos in music. You need a melody. And, you know, character point of view is like the melody of the song.
United 93 did that a little bit though, didn't it?
United 93 was brilliant. And I think that even Paul would say that that film was more documentary than feature. And in fact, a lot of that film, particularly it's an incredible film, but the scenes in that film that were set in air traffic control were actually, the cast of those scenes were the people who were actually in that room. It was, in fact, sort of a recreation. And then obviously the people aboard the United 93, the flight itself, was not a recreation. I mean, it was a recreation, but obviously with cast. But that film was brilliant. Yeah.
And it wouldn't have worked to have more of a main character used.
It would have been a different film.
Because of the link with reality, I mean, there are so many considerations.
Yeah. Her question was about the link to reality in United 93 in Paul Greengrass's movie. You know, look, if you look at Oliver Stone's movie, World Trade Center, he focused on those two men who were buried, right? Those two cops. So that was his narrative way in. Paul was sort of all over the place. He was much more interested in creating a mosaic of an experience instead of a character-driven point of view. Wall Street, I think Oliver's movie made a tremendous amount more money than United 93, but United 93 was sort of a greater piece of magnificence. Anything else? Yes.
The Trafficker.
Yeah.
That you said overwhelmed you. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
You know, it was the screenplay in the movie that meant the most to me, partly because Michael's a tremendous hero of mine, and because of my relationship with him, I really wanted to produce for him. It meant a lot to me to do something. It was the thing I worked on the hardest, and it was the worst thing I've ever written. And I don't think it was a coincidence. I think if you care that much about something, you put that much pressure on, it's gonna be hard. But the problem with that project is that this character was so overwhelmingly perfect, and the information and the ideas of the world of trafficking and gangsters, Michael and I compiled, I mean, it was embarrassing how much information we compiled. And I went out and I did more reporting and I came back and we were paralyzed. And what had happened, and I'll never make this mistake again, is it's possible to have too much information because the imagination and the idea of story is completely seized up. And we were both, we were overwhelmed and almost felt too loyal to the truth of him. And I couldn't release myself to sit here and tell a story. Like for instance, when you're hearing a public speaker and they're reading a speech and they're paying more attention to the paper, that's one kind of experience. But when someone's standing in front of you and speaking extemporaneously or more freely, it's a much more engaging experience usually. It's not that different in the writing experience. And also Michael had very specific points of view that were shifting, and that was just the eccentricities of working with Michael Mann and my own it just didn't work. It was just a bad partnership. Not bad, it just didn't. It was a great disappointment.
You made the comment about the truth being sometimes the truth is too dangerous to tell. So I'm going back and forth between that statement and this story. It was more personal for you than it was actually about the story of this man that was too dangerous to tell, or do you think it will come out in the future, you'll be able to do it? Maybe
with more distance between me and that, I'll be able to tell that story. When I was talking about stories that are too dangerous to tell, I was referring to two other stories. One was behind Michael's movie, The Insider, about tobacco, in which the corporate interests were stacked up against the truth of that getting out because it was purely too much money at stake. In the other case, with the sex trafficking story that I wrote in the film Trade, it was, until that article came out, there was no sense that sex slavery existed at all in the United States. And Thailand, yes. Cambodia, yes. Eastern Europe, absolutely. China, Dubai, Russians in Dubai, yeah, absolutely. But the idea that 50,000 girls and women a year are trafficked into the U.S. to be enslaved for sexual purposes was impossible. And it was a story that no one really wanted told. Today, we actually know, we take it for granted, there's a lot of articles about it. But at the time, the forces that marshaled against me in the New York Times we were completely ambushed. We thought that we were doing a service, and instead it was like taking the face of our readership and sticking it in something they didn't want to see. And it was a very hard experience. I guess my point of irony was that when it was turned into a film, suddenly the film was more easily digestible. It wasn't a great film, it could have been a lot better. But somehow the film gave it credibility that a newspaper magazine article could not. I think that we're vulnerable to the power of film and glamour and movie stars. And I think that it's why you see a lot of familiar faces on causes. They're representing certain causes, and when we see their faces, we pay attention as sort of selling, sort of marketing mechanisms, tools. And I don't know what to think about that. I think it's just we're vulnerable to it, but it could have a specific use or a terrific use. So I don't think we should be critical. I'm not critical of it, but I do think it's ironic that Kevin Kline, the star of Trade, could become the face of this issue, as opposed to the truth. That as was written in the magazine. it's complicated, and it's uncomfortable because it brings up a lot of issues that are uncomfortable for, I think, for journalists to face.